Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's event in the Humanities Centre for a talk that is increasingly topical by the day. Our very special guest today is Dr. Nick Warmuth, Research Associate in the Department of History and a specialist in Holocaust Studies, Fascism and European History. A genuine San Diego local, Dr. Warmuth has nonetheless had a truly international education. He received his bachelor's degree from San Diego State University and then relocated to England, where he earned a master's degree in modern European history from King's College London, the world's finest university. He subsequently earned his PhD from the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, with a dissertation on the American war crimes trial of Flossenburg concentration camp, 1946 to 1947. His latest publication is an article in the book, The United States Military and the Holocaust, to be published later this year by Texas A&M Press. It really is to USC's great advantage that we have on our campus someone with Dr. Warmuth's expertise in far-right political movements, and someone, moreover, with his lived experience of life in Viktor Orbán's Hungary. And that is what we'll hear about today. So, talking to us today about lessons learned from Orbán's Hungary, please welcome Dr. Nick Warmuth.
Thank you very much, Brian, for the introduction. And thank you all for joining me. As Brian just mentioned, this is going to be somewhat of a personal reflection. I put a lot of work into this, as I hope you'll see, but it is coming from a lived experience per se. At my 10 years living in Budapest. So, if you allow me, I'll continue. So in 2012, my wife and I decided to relocate to London, or from London to her home city in Budapest. For the first couple of years, while I was living there, I just kind of learned the city. I became acquainted with the food. There we go. I became acquainted with the food, mainly through my mother-in-law. I became acquainted with the language and the culture. I explored the various ruin pubs and kochmas. I enjoyed the various thermal baths. The things I loved the most was riding my bike on the Danube, as you can see. These are photos that I took while I was there, as well as wandering the streets of Pest with my head up, admiring all the architecture. I recall these memories first because I want to emphasize that much of my 10 years living there was really as romantic as it sounds. I lived in a stunningly beautiful city. It was impossibly affordable. It was safe and reliable public transportation, and the residents were generally friendly and welcoming. Sometimes they were a little perplexed by an American who chose to live in Hungary, but other than that, it was really enjoyable. However, in those same 10 years, I also witnessed firsthand the most aggressive period of Orbán's seizure of political power, as well as the rapid backsliding of democratic standards and protections in Hungary. I was there when he gave, when he gave his now infamous illiberal state speech. I was there when he welcomed Putin into the city while Russia was engaged in the first invasion of a sovereign European nation since the Second World War. I was there during the 2015 refugee crisis, to which the government attempted to pin the entire event on a single individual. I was a student at the very university that was forcibly removed by the government from the country, Central European University, CEU. And I was there when Orbán used the COVID pandemic to give himself emergency rule by decree powers. and then used it to proceeded to restrict LGBTQ rights. I was there when CPAC held its inaugural convention in the heart of Budapest, taking Orbán and Trump's shared cynicism for liberal democracy out from behind closed doors and together. So these are my lessons from Hungary. In 2007, Fareed Zakaria published an essay in Foreign Affairs entitled "The Rise of Illiberal Democracy," where he explored the growing disconnect between democracy and small L liberalism. He argues that despite democracy becoming the dominant form of government throughout the world, i.e. national sovereignty and free elections, many nations claiming to be democracies actually lack the liberal values that supposedly come part and parcel with Western democratic systems, such as we see in the United States at the moment. So we're talking about rule of law, separation of powers, and protections of individual autonomy. By the end of the 20th century, specifically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Western-style democracy was quickly becoming the only game in town. This paradigm, that liberal democracy was the ultimate stage in the evolution of society, was the underlying impetus for Fukuyama to proclaim the end of history. Could you imagine if he did that now? I mean, he'd be a meme. So we fast forward to 2014, and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party had recently won their second supermajority voting power in parliament. By that time, he had already rewritten the constitution, replaced hundreds of judges, including the Constitutional Court, with loyalists, and overheard electoral laws to favor the incumbent. With the political structure effectively sewn up, and he still hasn't lost an election, nor his supermajority to this day, Orbán turned his attention to political culture. At an annual Fidesz-supported summer youth convention in the Carpathian Hills of Transylvania, Orbán delivered maybe the second most consequential speech of his life between the typical statements of politicians. Orbán spoke of complete resetting of political life in Hungary. He proclaimed that American soft power had deteriorated due to liberal values, which invite corruption, sex, and violence. Meanwhile, Europe has become singularly focused on solving the immigrant situation, as he called it, thereby leaving the white working class behind. Therefore, Orbán declared that the defining issue of the day was to, quote, figure out a way of organizing communities in a manner that maintains the nation's competitiveness. So in other words, it's survival. He then hailed countries like Singapore, China, India, Turkey, and Russia as model nations in this newfound struggle. He then proceeded that in order to rid Hungary of harmful Western European dogmas, quote, we need to state that a democracy is not necessarily liberal. Just because something is not liberal, it can still be a democracy. We have to abandon liberal methods and principles of organizing a society, as well as the liberal way to look at the world. The Hungarian nation is not a simple sum of individuals, but a community that needs to be organized, strengthened, and developed. And in this sense, the new state we are building is an illiberal state. It does not deny foundational values of liberalism as freedom, etc., but it does not make this ideology a central element of state organization, but applies a specific national, particular approach in its stead. So he's placing nation over freedom. At the time this speech was presented, I had been living in Budapest for just under 2 years, and at that time, I was actually preparing myself to begin my doctoral studies at CEU in the fall. It's an actual Facebook post. So CEU was established in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and via its founder, George Soros, has been intimately entangled with Hungarian politics ever since. In the late 1980s, Viktor Orbán was a 20-something-year-old law student with political ambitions. At the same time, the Hungarian-American Holocaust survivor, businessman, and philanthropist, George Soros, had centered his attention on his nation of birth, with goals of providing the country's politically minded youth with the tools necessary to establish a democracy of their own. Orbán, as well as many other founding members of Fidesz, the political party, would be among his earliest beneficiaries. Since 1986, Soros had personally promoted the small Bibo István College of Advanced Studies law students and generously funded its politically active students, of whom Viktor Orbán was one. Soros's Open Society Foundation, still at that time in its infancy, funded the student political journal Századvég. Keep that name in mind. It means end of the century. It also paid for language courses, fellowships, trips abroad, and dissent leaflet printing. I think some of the governments call that sort of thing propaganda. In 1989, Soviet communism in Hungary collapsed, instantly creating a political vacuum. The 26-year-old Orbán was a new dad and working part-time at the Open Society Foundation. He was also extremely active in his center-left liberal democratic student movement turned legitimate political party Fidesz, which is an acronym for Alliance of Young Democrats. On June 16th, the hero of the 1956 uprising, Imre Nagy, was formally rehabilitated and given a proper burial. That day, Orbán gave the speech of his life to more than 200,000 people in central Budapest Hero Square, capitulating him to national recognition. Armed with not only aspirations, but a legitimate popular momentum of leading the country to democratic success, Orbán accepted a 9-month fellowship grant from the Open Society Foundation to study political philosophy at Pembroke College in Oxford. But things were moving at a blistering pace back home, and Orbán, along with his wife and infant daughter, with whom he brought to England, returned to Budapest just after 4 months. This was just in time to help Fidesz begin campaigning for the upcoming parliamentary elections. The following year, Hungary held its first elections, and despite winning a number of seats, it was the socialist coalition parties that took the majority. Orbán quickly realized that Fidesz would never be competitive against the prevailing center-left parties. And so, seeing a void between the collective left and the far-right fringe parties, he made the decision to pivot to the center-right, which immediately caused infighting within the Fidesz party. By 1994, when the next elections came around, between 400 and 500 Fidesz members quit the party, including the co-founding member and his former roommate in college, Gábor Fodor. It was at this same exact time that Soros began making efforts to support the region's democratic momentum with vigorous pragmatism. So leaning on his mentor, Karl Popper's philosophy of the Open Society, Soros funded the plan to establish a collection of graduate colleges throughout the former Soviet bloc. I'm sorry, I just have to pause for a second. Sometimes I say Soros, that's how you pronounce it in Hungarian. So if I go back and forth between Soros and Soros, that's why. I just realized I did that, I'm sorry. Okay. So in 1991, the CEU had opened its doors in Prague, Warsaw, and Soros's childhood city of Budapest with the express mission to provide the new nation's future leaders with an education on par with the West. And in so doing, both faculty and students were recruited from around the world to teach such an ambitious legitimacy. The university was officially accredited by the state of New York. Due to various political reasons, however, the original multi-campus plan was eventually abandoned, and by 1995, all of CU's operation had been centralized to Budapest. In the meantime, Fidesz, now under complete control of Viktor Orbán, went through a complete transformation. In fact, Fidesz no longer stands as an acronym for Young Democrat Alliance. In 1995, they rebranded it as Fidesz Hungarian Civic Party. So Fidesz is just a name now. The scruffy, everyman look was abandoned for suits and clean haircuts, and while Orbán is famous still for his colloquial communication style, it was now accompanied by professions of faith, of family, and Hungarian homeland. At the 7th Party Congress in April 1995, 9 months after his parliamentary defeat, Orbán claimed, and this is quote, "In my view, the formation of blocs, the emergence of a socialist center-left and a moderate center-right dominated by the middle classes, it is in the interest of the country. In the center we have, if we stand alone, no chance against either the right or the left. To my mind, there is no possibility of cooperating with the left. My answer is that Fidesz must seek cooperation with forces politically right of center." By the 1998 elections, Fidesz, having built its conservative right-wing coalition, had managed to topple the center-left, and Orbán finally took a seat as Hungary's prime minister for the first time. There are two critical takeaways from this part of the history. One is that Orbán made a conscious and strategic shift to the right in order to obtain power as PM. And number two, without George Soros, Fidesz would not exist. Before Fidesz was even registered as a political party, the OSF, the Open Society Foundation, had given the fledgling youth movement nearly $4 million, which in today would be about $125 million. And so because I'm still actually technically in the introduction part of the lecture, I'm going to substitute a detailed explanation in the years between 1998 and 2010 with the quote, and this is from a biographer of Orbán. "Since 2010, Viktor Orbán and his team have almost effortlessly put in place, without any resistance worthy of the name, a skillfully veiled authoritarian system. This process would not have been possible without the moral bankruptcy of a system mired in corruption and increasingly discredited by political and economic incompetence, crowned by the all too evident failure of the center-left elite." That one hurt when I read it. The 2010 elections truly were a consequential victory for Orbán. When all was said and done, Fidesz had acquired 263 seats, or 68% of parliament. And it was the very first time in Hungarian history that the party had secured a 2/3 supermajority. In 4 years, Orbán successfully consolidated his powers in 4 central areas. First, he ramped up his national populist rhetoric and used Fidesz's supermajority to give citizenship, which comes with which comes voting power, to all ethnic Hungarians living in the former Hungarian territories that the country was forced to cede after the First World War. So these are Hungarians living outside of Hungary. Most of them had never lived in Hungary. He also signed into law on June 4th, which was the day Hungary signed the Treaty of Trianon, as a day of national solidarity. Second, Fidesz employed its supermajority to abolish the safeguard clause that required a 4/5 majority of parliament to directly amend and or replace the constitution itself. And then Fidesz got to work on doing the latter. In February 2011, they drafted an entirely new one. And 2 months later, the bill was fast-tracked to Parliament, and within 9 days, the resolution to replace the Constitution was adopted, and it formally became law January 1st, 2012. The third reason, or part, regarding the judiciary, Fidesz increased the number of the Constitutional Court justices from 11 to 15. It filled the vacant seats with loyalists, and then increased the terms from 9 to 12 years. It also reduced the retirement age for all judges from 68 to 62, immediately opening 274 seats. And finally, Orbán established a new media council to govern all state TV and radio. As well, he starved independent networks and newspapers, forcing them to either sell to loyal oligarchs or close shop completely. It was widely reported that between 80 and 85% of all media today in Hungary is directly controlled or indirectly influenced by Orbán and Fidesz. The following year, in February 2015, Vladimir Putin traveled to Budapest. In fact, it was February 17th, just days after the signing of the Minsk II ceasefire with Ukraine after the land grabbing in Crimea. I remember the traffic that was the traffic that his motorcade caused as he traveled up Andrassy to lay a wreath at Hero Square. And I remember the thousands of protesters waving the EU flag as well. The stated reason for this visit was to renew Hungary's gas supply contract and to finalize negotiations on what would become the Paks 2 nuclear power plant project, to which Russia would provide 10 billion euros towards its construction. Of course, the unstated objective for Putin's visit was to show the world that he had an ally inside the European Union. One report proclaimed that, quote, by inviting Putin, Budapest has broken Europe's tacit agreement on a united Russia policy and is arguing for a normalization of relations with the nation. It was around this time that I distinctly remember passively acknowledging to some friends the seemingly impossible dynamic of having an increasingly aggressive and even an authoritarian government who appears to have just shunned all of its closest allies, that still allows an outspoken institution like CEU to exist. And we're 10 minutes walking from Parliament. We're just down the street. And I've said this a couple times. It was little that I knew at the time that my confusion would prove not only founded but more prophetic than I could have imagined. By the summer of that year, the refugee crisis was at its most disastrous period. According to a Pew Research report, more than 1.3 million people applied for asylum in Europe in 2015 alone. Half of these applications were filed by people coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Just to put that into perspective, the last spike was in 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in which 700,000 people applied for asylum. Hungary not only sits within the Schengen zone of the European Union, which critically allows for the free movement of peoples and goods between nations, but it sits on the frontier of those borders. Now, Croatia was added in 2023, and actually in 2025, Romania and Bulgaria are also officially part of the Schengen zone. This is from back then. As such, Hungary became the first port of entry for more than 390,000 refugees. Of course, this was portrayed by the Hungarian authorities not as a humanitarian crisis, but as a Muslim invasion. Hungary responded by building a massive fence along the entire length of its southern border with Serbia and Croatia. For the majority of refugees who made it into Hungary, the first stop was Keleti train station, from which most planned to travel on to Germany. Scenes of crowded confusion were presented on Hungarian TV on a daily basis. On September 1st, the Hungarian authorities actually closed Keleti station to refugees and refused them entry onto their scheduled trains. The chaos that ensued only amplified the government's narrative. Meanwhile, CEU, with support from the OSF, had opened its facilities to multiple NGOs and humanitarian programs. It proudly became the central hub for relevant updates and information, as well as recruiting volunteers and donations to legitimate sources. In January 2016, it launched the Open Learning Initiative, or OLIVE, a weekend class program for legally registered refugees and asylum seekers. That CEU staff and students offered courses including English language training, academic tutoring, and introduction to Hungarian life and culture. These actions speak nothing to the efforts that OSF made on its own behalf as well. In late September, George Soros released a brief essay entitled Rebuilding the Asylum System, in which he criticized Europe's current management of the crisis and offered a comprehensive solution to end the unnecessary human suffering. In the fall of 2017, less than a year before the next parliamentary elections, the Hungarian government initiated a campaign in which they accused George Soros of having masterminded the resettlement of millions of foreign immigrants in Europe, thereby replacing and ultimately destroying traditional European peoples and values. The government sent out a national consultation questionnaire to every Hungarian household entitled the Soros Plan, which asked citizens if they support, among other things, George Soros wanting to bring 1 million immigrants from Africa and the Middle East into the EU annually. They asked if they agree that his lobbying Brussels to require EU member states to pay 15,000 euros in aid per immigrant. And they asked if they support Soros's desires to subordinate European culture to make ease of integration to the migrants. Accompanying the national consultation was an unimaginably massive public ad campaign targeting Soros. Billboard after billboard after billboard were plastered with the black and white image of George Soros. It really did give the impression that not only that he was everywhere, but he was watching you. Another small anecdote I'll add is that Hungary hosted the FINA Aquatic World Championships in 2017 that summer. It's the largest international swim and pool sports competition outside the Olympics. The government literally built a state-of-the-art swim facility for this event. It's called the Duna Arena. During those 2 weeks, the posters were gone. So the government claimed that it received nearly 2.4 million responses out of 8 million letters sent out. For this, the government spent more than 2 billion forints. And while accompanying this advertising campaign cost 7.5 billion forints. So then I was in the middle of my third year of the PhD program when those passive musings that I referenced earlier were finally confirmed. On April 4th, 2017, without any prior consultation whatsoever, and having reduced all plenary discussion to a mere 3 hours, Fidesz used its supermajority to pass an amendment to the Higher Education Act, which ultimately undermined CEU's operations in Hungary. Among the 5 primary clauses introduced, 2 seemingly focused exclusively on CEU. So the first, all foreign universities must have a physical operation in their home country. So CEU, while it's been accredited by the state of New York since its inception, never actually established a brick-and-mortar office in the U.S. And secondly, all academic operations may only continue after securing a signed agreement between the 2 respective governments, i.e. Hungary and the United States. But as we know, the higher education system in this country does not work at the federal level. So this was an impossible demand, and despite Hungary accommodating a number of foreign schools, most of which are all EU members, this amendment only applied to CEU. Lastly, the law would go into effect on January 1st, 2018, by which time CEU will have met the requirements or ceased all academic activities. So what was now becoming Lex CEU was immediately met with outrage both in Hungary and abroad. There was mass demonstrations and formal petitions raised. And on April 9th, I, along with 70,000 other people, marched through the streets of Budapest, but ultimately it was in vain. The very next day, the bill was signed into law, and CEU had until mid-October to fulfill the new requirements. Despite pushback and multiple attempts at negotiation by CEU, the Hungarian government refused to make any concessions. And when CEU did ultimately comply with the demands, we established a presence and initiated joint courses with Bard University in New York. As well, we secured a signed agreement with the then New York Governor Cuomo. The Hungarian government, just simply refused to sign the contract. Instead, with just days to spare, it curiously postponed the final decision by another year, to December 2018. So we were left in limbo for another year. We could continue to teach and graduate current students, but we could no longer do enrollments up to the 2019 academic year. In November 2018, so this is just weeks before the fate of CU was decided, I was actually in Washington, D.C., starting a 9-month fellowship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So I concluded that, I finished it, and I took a much-deserved break to decompress back home in San Diego. As November turned into December, the Hungarian government continuously refrained to sign the contract, ultimately letting the window expire. When I returned to Budapest in October 2019, CEU had physically moved to Vienna. By March of 2020, the COVID pandemic had shut the world down, and I spent the rest of my write-up time at home, physically cut off from the university because of the COVID restrictions. I couldn't cross the border. So before I move on, I just want to acknowledge that throughout everything CU's been put through, it never shut down and it never missed an enrollment year. All right. In January 2019, the origins of the Soros plan, the campaign was revealed to have been the mastermind of two political communication strategists. This is Arthur Finkelstein and his protege, George Birnbaum. Finkelstein, some of you may or may not know, earned his bona fides as a Republican strategist under the Nixon campaigns of 1968, 1972. After that, he worked with North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms, known for his opposition to civil rights, to disability rights, to environmentalism, to feminism, to gay rights, affirmative action, and of course, access to abortion. And then in 1979, Finkelstein went on to become a key research analyst for Ronald Reagan's Republican primary campaign. Upon his death in 2017, Finkelstein was characterized as being less flamboyant, but arguably more influential to Republican politics than Lee Atwater or Roger Ailes. He is often regarded as the man who made the word liberal a pejorative term. While his advisory role oversaw an entire generational cohort of GOP politicians, Finkelstein eventually went international. In 1996, he advised Benjamin Netanyahu to victory in Israel. A decade later, having brought Birnbaum in, the two are linked to political victories in Romania, in the Czech Republic, in Bulgaria, and there's more. And then in 2008, Finkelstein and Birnbaum were introduced, apparently through Netanyahu, to Viktor Orbán. The two men signed a contract with Századvég, the foundation which is funded by Fidesz, which had morphed from Soros's funded newspaper, student newspaper, into a think tank. And then they came back in 2014, Birnbaum and Finkelstein, with the effects of the refugee crisis still front of mind in 2014. The challenge for 2018 was how to refocus the narrative. So speaking to a Swiss magazine in 2019, Birnbaum recalled, quote, "Arthur always said that the Allies were not fighting the Nazis, but Hitler. The Americans were not fighting al-Qaeda, but Osama bin Laden." So in other words, the migrant crisis needed a figurehead, and George Soros was the perfect villain. Not only was he active in dealing with the asylum seekers, but he embodied big foreign capital. The anti-Soros campaign actually started all the way back in 2013, characterizing him as a financial predator of Hungary. Only after 2015 did the refugee angle actually present itself. But with Soros now the public enemy number one in the abstract, Orbán was then free to turn his attention to the material representation of Soros. And the jewel in that crown was CEU and the OSF. Open Society Foundation ceased all operations in Hungary and moved its international headquarters from Budapest to Berlin in May 2018. All right. At a party congress in 2015, Fidesz founding member and current Speaker of the National Assembly, Laszlo Kövér, who has an incredible Hungarian mustache. We do not want, this is a quote from him, we do not want the gender craziness. We do not want to make Hungary a futureless society of man-hating women and feminine men living in dread of women and considering families and children only as barriers to self-fulfillment. And we would like if our daughters would consider as the highest quality of self-fulfillment the possibility of giving birth to our grandchildren, which is to say, of course, the prevailing position for the Hungarian state is the preservation of the traditional patriarchal family. Since then, the Orbán government has made significant efforts to codify this preferred way of life. Nevertheless, since moving to Budapest, my personal experience was that the city's LGBTQ community seemed to grow ever more confident with each year. This picture's from, I think, 2021. Every summer, thousands of people walk, dance, and laugh their way down Pest's main boulevards in a massive pride parade. Of course, the usual opponents are out shouting obscenities, but generally speaking, it's a big party. And I have a number of friends from CEU that participated every year. In August 2018, this was summer break, and just a few months after Fidesz's third consecutive parliamentary victory, the Hungarian government issued a draft decree that all master's and doctoral programs in gender studies were hereby revoked. There are only 2 universities in Hungary that have ever had gender studies program. That's CEU and ELTE. Founded in 1635, it's the most prestigious public research university in the country, in Budapest. It's in Budapest, and it's a prestigious university throughout Hungary. With no further explanation, the affected parties were given 24 hours to respond before the decree was initiated. As expected, outrage ensued, and responding to that backlash, a Fidesz spokesperson told CNN, quote, "The government's standpoint is that people are born either male or female, and we do not consider it acceptable for us to talk about socially constructed genders rather than biological sexes," end quote. The other excuses was that it was a waste on taxpayer money. CEU is entirely privatized. And ELTA, back then, was 8,000 euros per student at the time. It was also said that such degrees were just a waste in and of themselves. CEU's gender studies alumni have reported employment from Kyrgyzstan to Iceland, and in such fields as higher education, economy, and finance. And then finally, that of course such programs do not align with traditional Christian values, but somebody must tell Notre Dame that. So 2 years later, on Friday the 13th, 2020, the world shut down from COVID. The Hungarian government immediately declared a state of emergency and granted Orbán the power of rule by decree. On March 30th, Fidesz used its supermajority vote in parliament to essentially codify his unrestricted power by refraining to implement a mandatory sunset clause on the rule by decree measure. Additionally, the new law introduced prison terms of up to 5 years for publicizing false information that alarms the public and or impedes the government's efforts to protect its citizens. The very next day, which just happened to be the International Transgender Day of Visibility, Fidesz again claimed its supermajority to end all legal recognition of trans people. The new law now defines one's gender by the number of chromosomes at birth, therefore denying individuals the previously held right to alter their gender and name on official documents. With only 2 weeks left before 2020 finally died, Parliament adopted its 9th constitutional amendment declaring that, quote, "a mother is a woman and a father is a man." Further provisions stipulated that Hungary protects the institution of marriage as a community of life established between a man and a woman based on a voluntary decision, and the family as the basis for the survival of the nation. The basis of the family relationship is marriage and the parent-child relationship. It continues, "Every child has the right to the protection and care necessary for his or her proper physical, mental, and moral development. Hungary protects the right of children to self-identify according to their birth gender and ensures an upbringing in accordance with the values based on the country's constitutional identity and Christian culture. This amendment effectively banned gay couples from adopting, and what was previously used by same-sex couples as somewhat of a loophole, the single-parent adoption will be nearly impossible. The following summer, in mid-June 2021, Parliament voted to adopt legislation that would increase sentences for sex crimes against children. While few, if any, would argue against such protections, the bill included last-minute additions that effectively conflated homosexuality with pedophilia, thereby, as critics have rightly claimed, further demonizes the LGBTQ community. Included in the additional clauses is a requirement to label all media and entertainment content that might fall into the category of LGBTQ as, quote, not recommended for those under the age of 18. As well, in an attempt to curb the popularizing of LGBTQ life, all programs and advertisements deemed unsuitable are restricted to the hours between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. This includes shows like Modern Family. There were even episodes of Friends that were in question. As well, sex education is restricted to government-approved material, which will prohibit any information on LGBTQ topics or issues. So it's a don't say gay bill. Lastly, the bill will order the creation of a sex offender database. And again, on its face, the bill includes what appear to be rational protections of children. But the deliberate and last-minute additions of further protections from depictions of gay and trans people is obviously where the problem lies. What's more, by declaring depictions of LGBTQ life as being harmful to children, the Hungarian state is codifying the dehumanization of millions of their own citizens. Anecdotally, I remember watching the Euro 2020 football match between Germany and Hungary, which of course was postponed to 2021. And I was in central Budapest in packed Liberty Park watching these giant screens while the real thing was in Munich. And it was about a week after the anti-gay bill was passed, and the match, while ending in a draw, the next day's headlines were of the sea of rainbow that flowed through the Allianz Stadium, taunting the Hungarians. Lastly, it disappoints me to say that as of Thursday, February 27, 2025, the Hungarian government declared that it's banning the 2025 Budapest Pride Parade. In his State of the Nation last Saturday, Orbán stated, "Let us write into the Constitution that a person is either male or female." Of course, this echoes Trump's executive order last month. So we'll have to wait to see what happens for Hungary. But I can place my bet now. And this brings us to 2022. So that was my last year living in Hungary, which coincides with the first year of the other fever dream that is the Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, which came to my adopted home city that year. CPAC may be the exciting outward-facing forum through which the public has been given a window into the relationship between Hungary and the GOP, but what it represents is much deeper and much more cynical. Just before the 2018 midterm elections, it's been reported that the Hungarian government spent $150,000 on 3 different US-based lobbying groups, according to public records from the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The firms of Barnes and Thornburg, Policy Impact Communications, remember that one, and Monk Policy and Law took $50,000 each to lobby the White House, Congress, and the State Department, respectively. But that's not even close to the total amount of money Hungary spent, which was $3.5 million in 2018. The lion's share of that, about $3 million, was spent on the Magyar Foundation of North America, the MFNA, as well as going to former Florida Republican Congressman Connie Mack, who was working for Zásadvég Foundation. The MFNA is apparently led by former co-workers and mentees of Arthur Finkelstein. And then there's the $20,000 each paid to both Steve Bannon and Milo Yiannopoulos for speeches given in Budapest. In August 2021, Tucker Carlson traveled to Budapest to meet with Orbán, as well as film an entire week of television for his then employer, Fox News. He billed the week as presenting to the American people, quote, a small country with a lot of lessons for the rest of us. Carlson conducted a one-on-one interview with Orbán as well as the foreign minister. He took a helicopter tour over the anti-immigrant fence along the Hungarian-Serbian border, and he produced a featured documentary entitled Hungary vs. Soros, The Fight for Civilization. It's worth mentioning, according to a 2021 New York Times article, that Richard Dick Carlson, Tucker's father, was listed as a director for policy impact communications, one of those lobbying firms that the Hungarian government paid in 2018. Although the same article states that the chairman of that foundation denies any connection between the firm and Tucker's trip to Hungary. The following month, Vice President Pence and Attorney General Jeff Sessions also made appearances in Budapest, the latter of whom received a modest fee by the Danube Institute, a conservative English language think tank based in Budapest and supported by the Lajos Batthyány Foundation, which is a Fidesz-funded nonprofit. And finally, on May 19th, 2020, and May 19th and 20 of 2022, Budapest hosted the inaugural CPAC Hungary Convention. According to their official website, under the tagline, God, Homeland, Family, some 1,500 people, 200 of whom were foreign guests, came together to fulfill the globalist liberals' worst nightmare, international cooperation of national forces. So keynote speakers included, of course, Viktor Orbán, Tucker Carlson, Rick Santorum, the Pennsylvania senator, UKIP leader Nigel Farage, Spain's far-right Vox Party leader Santiago Abascal, and of course Donald Trump submitted a video message. CPAC Hungary returned to Budapest in 23, in 24, and it is planned to return this year, but you obviously get the point. So I want to jump ahead to the current Trump administration, and in particular Project 2025, which we all know Trump had nothing to do with. However, I will point to you that one of several so-called Project 2025 online trackers places so far 36% of its objectives have been implemented. But I'm not interested in defining or definitively linking Trump to 2025, and it's irrelevant at this point. But I am interested in exploring the wider connections. The Hungarian investigative news outlet Alatso published an article in August of last year in which they claim Orbán's political network likely had a direct influence in Project 2025. So please oblige me while I quote a little bit longer passage. Quote, originally a proponent of the Reaganite neoconservatism, the Heritage Foundation in recent years has become influenced by Trump's brand of populism and shifted towards isolationist foreign policy, especially when it comes to responding to the actions of Putin's Russia. This transformation was finalized by Kevin Roberts, becoming the think tank's president in 2021. Roberts saw Orbán's illiberal state as an example to follow. In 2022, Orbán welcomed Roberts in Budapest, and Heritage signed a cooperation agreement with the Danube Institute. In December 2023, the Heritage Foundation hosted an international conference where people affiliated with the Orbán government, including officials of the Hungarian embassy in Washington, lobbied U.S. congressmen and women, I presume, to vote against the Biden administration's planned military aid in Ukraine. More recently, the investigative organization of ProPublica published hours of training videos, I think it was 14 hours, made for internal use by the Heritage Foundation, instructing would-be political appointees in furthering the aims of Project 2025. Several of the people appearing in these videos have previously worked with the Danube Institute or other similar pro-Orbán administrations. One such individual, Spencer Chrétien, is the assistant director of Project 2025. The article continues, Chrétien was previously involved in building ties between the Heritage Foundation and Hungary. In May 2024, the Hungarian Center for Fundamental Rights, another state-funded organization, hosted representatives from the Heritage Foundation, including Chrétien. In this event entitled "We Win, They Lose, America's Choice," he presented Project 2025. The project was also showcased in Hungary at another event in February 2024, this time organized by the Danube Institute. There, the Heritage Foundation was represented by Troop Hemingway, senior advisor to the foundation and co-director and staff placement for Project 2025. On November 2nd, 2024, this is 3 days before the presidential election, CBS News published a comprehensive report based on Alazzo's investigations that I just highlighted. In addition, the article states that during the speech he gave to supporters that summer, Viktor Orbán detailed just how close his relationship with Trump has gotten. Quote, "We have entered into the policy writing system of President Donald Trump's team. We have deep involvement there," end quote. The article also states that while both men remain cagey on specifics of their communications, sources close to the Hungarian government describe the use of think tanks funded by the government as conduits to exchange information with the conservative U.S. think tanks via in-person meetings every 3 months on topics like Ukraine, family policy, and winning elections. Among the primary Hungarian think tanks involved is Századvég, which is, quote, known for working with American political GOP consultants, including the late Arthur Finkelstein. There's tons more information on this topic, but I hope I've cobbled together a clear enough picture to get my point across. So, lastly, if you'll just indulge me a little bit longer, I'm going to sew this all up. Last summer, Zach Beauchamp, a journalist for the progressive online news outlet Vox, a de facto expert on contemporary Hungarian politics in the English language space, published his first book, The Reactionary Spirit. His concept, which gives the book its title, refers to a particular mindset or political disposition that is characterized by a deep-seated opposition to modern liberal democracy and a longing for a perceived lost order. Beauchamp argues that this is not just about specific policies or ideologies per se, but a broader emotional and intellectual orientation, in addition to a nostalgia for a perceived lost golden age, and in an ideological rejection of the liberal aspects of democracy, so the rule of law, separation of powers, protection of human rights. I think Orbán put it freedom. Key components of the reactionary spirit include a preference for authority and order, opposition to progressive change, and a romanticized perception of national power and hierarchy. Beauchamp explains that the principal characteristic of America is democracy, and that without democracy there is no America. But even the founding fathers struggled with incorporating liberal values when it came to slavery. The Civil War was therefore a consequence of this reactionary spirit revealing itself among the South. It appeared yet again in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, and, as Beauchamp explains, once more in the form of the Tea Party following the election of Barack Obama. But these are the domestic problems. He goes on to state that by the 21st century, nearly all of Europe, indeed the rest of the world, had established liberal democratic governments, and that, based on the political catastrophes that were fascism and communism, democracy had appeared to have won. However, this structure carried with it the very same vulnerabilities as the United States has shown to have had throughout its own history. In effect, America's international exporting of constitutional liberal democracy included the stowaway principles of the reactionary spirit. I personally find this fascinating. My doctoral degree from CEU is specifically in comparative history, and while my dissertation does not explicitly incorporate a comparative methodology, I've nevertheless studied extensively in the field of comparative fascist studies. One overarching topic within this genre is that of transnationalism, and in particular, most historians have abandoned the idea that Italian fascism and German National Socialism merely distributed a fascist playbook of sorts to subordinate would-be dictators. In other words, fascism as an ideology did not flow in a purely top-down direction from the two regimes mentioned above, to be consumed and practiced by various fascist movements throughout Europe. So I'm thinking of the Arrow Cross in Hungary, the Ustasha in Croatia, the Iron Guard in Romania. Rather, there's a collective consensus among fascist studies experts that the sharing of ideas is a two-way street. In fact, there were aspirations to create a new fascist global order, a network of authoritarian regimes to rule the world. To what extent that relationship would have endured would be an exercise in ahistorical presumption. But my point, in returning to the growing authoritarianism in the contemporary world, is that the idea of characterizing Hungary as being a, or even the model for authoritarianism in the United States, or any other country for that matter, is a futile exercise. Rather, we should be looking at this as a transnational network of ideas, of strategies, of cooperation. Karl Marx himself couldn't have predicted how his concept of communism would have been employed by Lenin and Stalin and Mao, and he literally left them a handbook. The fascists, by comparison, were making it up as they went along. I mean, sure, they had a goal, and of course, that route to get there was not laid out for them. But even as an example, their iconography was stolen. So the authoritarians of the 21st century, for all the existing knowledge and lessons, are indeed making it up as they go along. But they're also sharing their notes. And not unlike the fascists of the mid-20th century, I am in no way suggesting that this is to be taken lightly or that they are incapable of truly consequential catastrophe. Rather, what I'm saying is that the opposition must treat all authoritarian agents, Le Pen in France, Wilders in the Netherlands, Weidel in Germany, Kickl in Austria, and of course Orbán in Hungary, with serious concern, but also as a unified threat. This requires a unified defense, a transnational liberal defense community that does not necessarily function through our state apparatus. Currently, Hungary is no longer a democracy. But as Bálint Magyar, who actually is affiliated with CEU, just stated last week in Foreign Affairs on his article, Why America Won't Become Hungary, Orbán exploited the benefit of serious design flaws within the country's post-1989 constitution. As Magyar puts it, quote, Hungary's democracy resembled a single compartment ship that sank with a single puncture. U.S. democracy is more like a compartmentalized ship that can withstand substantial damage without capsizing. So America's democracy may rock, it will not sink. Thank you.